It's an uncommon privilege to get to speak at Frank Schramling's funeral. We're here in a place that Frank loved. As Terry's just shared with us, this is a context in which he found peace and joy. He spoke of working in this context as a ministry. Often we kind of have this narrow understanding of what ministry is. It has to be something physically within a church building. But I think Frank had a really expansive and correct understanding of what ministry could look like. And certainly his work in the garden was very much part of that. We're officially out here for COVID reasons. This is the best ventilation that we have available to us. But it seems to me that this is also an enormously fitting place in which to remember Frank. This is Frank's cathedral surrounding us. The flowers and the trees around us are in so many ways the work of his hands. This is art that he collaborated with God to create. And here in the cathedral, we're surrounded by these stories of Frank. Some of them are written down on paper and hung from, there's St. Francis holding up some of them for us, and some of them are hanging from the tent. And still more of them are hanging in our hearts. In the Creed, it says that Jesus will come again to judge the living and the dead. And maybe we picture that as a courtroom scene. So Jesus is up on a dais with a big gavel, and it's terrifying whether you are going to get to go free or go to jail. So it's kind of a fearsome scene. But maybe we could also imagine judging the living and the dead as more of a scene like this. So as a garden with all of the stories of your life hanging from trees, and you and Jesus get to walk through the garden and see these stories that you told about yourself, stories that other people told about you, some of which maybe you've never heard before. You walk through the garden with Jesus, and together you read them, and Jesus will periodically point at a story and say, "What do you think about that one?" And there's an opportunity then as you read the story. There's an opportunity to apologize, to say, "I'm sorry" for people who you hurt or who you let down. There's an opportunity to forgive people who hurt you or let you down. There's an opportunity to hold the wistfulness of stories that maybe you wish had a different ending. Or risks you didn't take, or paths you didn't choose, or just things you didn't do, because there's only so much time in the world. You know, if you're admitted to 4 colleges and you chose one, there's 3 colleges you didn't go to. And so there's a wistfulness in the experiences that we didn't take. And there's an opportunity maybe to be surprised about the things that you said or did that were a big deal for other people. About the acts of kindness and generosity, large and small, some so small that to you might not even remember them before this moment, which were a source of healing and encouragement to someone who needed it. If the Day of Judgment is anything like that, if it's a walk through the garden with Jesus, what do you think Frank is noticing as he walks through the path that contains all the stories of his life, all of his own stories and all the stories that people told about him? What do you think Jesus is pointing out to him as he walks? Well, so Terry mentioned this. Maybe Frank is noticing that more than one story has the word curmudgeon in it. And I suspect that's probably not a surprise to him. Frank knew that he had a temper. He knew that he wanted things a certain way and that he could become seriously irritated when he had the sense that someone else was horning in on his territory. See Nancy Entrican's story in which she says that for months Frank referred to her as that woman. And I think, Frank holds the record for quitting Grace Memorial the most number of times. On some occasions he quit twice or even 3 times in one day. It's a record I expect that will never, ever be broken. But I hope as well that Frank is noticing and being surprised by and being delighted by how deeply people loved him and how much his work mattered to them and how his acts of kindness changed them. If Frank lost his temper sometimes, my suspicion is that it was because he was carrying within him ourselves. I suspect there was a part of him that was afraid that nobody noticed his work, or appreciated his work, or needed him, or loved him. And I think sometimes when that story got a particularly big foothold inside of him, it would burst forth as anger. It would burst forth as I quit. I hope, and I know, there were moments in his life when he knew that story wasn't true. I hope there were lots of moments here at Grace where he knew that that story wasn't true, that he was loved and was needed, and that people saw the ministry that he did on the grounds and in the parish hall and in so many other places. And I hope, and now in the resurrection, he is encountering the final proof that that story was never true, that he was and is deeply loved and needed and now so profoundly missed. Consider a couple of the stories that are hanging up here. So here's Joe Bronson's story. It's Maundy Thursday, and Joe's young goddaughter Claire is there with her doll. Claire's really young at this point, and the moment of foot washing comes, and Claire goes up, and Frank and Joe were not far behind, and Claire presents her doll to Frank. And Frank, parish curmudgeon, right, carefully and gently washes the doll's feet. So this is Maundy Thursday in a single moment, right? You need to explain the theology of Maundy Thursday. There it is in one story. And maybe Frank guessed that this act of loving kindness was a source of comfort for Claire. But I suspect he did not guess that as Joe Bronson witnessed this moment, that her heart was broken open. That it was a huge deal for her. It was a moment of profound holiness. This was a God sighting for Joe. And Joe says that to this day, she can't tell that story without weeping. I understand why. Or consider Alyssa Harris' story. Terry alluded to that a second ago. So Alyssa is in a time of depression and poverty, and not poverty of the metaphorical sort, by the way. Like, this is not some poverty of the spirit. This is I don't know how I'm going to buy my groceries kind of poverty, and feeling so worn down, and because we live in the society we do, feeling ashamed about being poor. And Alyssa comes by the church a lot, and she sees Frank a lot, and he always has a kind word for her. And they talk about what it is to be poor. Frank knows something about this, and maybe, picking up on what Terry just shared with us, maybe they talk a little about what it is to struggle with depression. Or maybe they don't have to. Henry Nouwen has this concept called the wounded healer, where folks just sort of see you're hurt, and as a consequence, you have this authority to help other people. And maybe Frank had some of that. And through these experiences, Alyssa feels less alone. She says that for her, these moments with Frank are an oasis. Or, it's not one of the stories that's written here, but it's a story that is hanging out inside all of us. How many Friday evenings did Frank set the tables for the Friday feast? How many times did he come in early to set up for the quilters? All of these acts of love. If James is right, whom we heard from earlier, that it's it's in the work that our faith becomes real. Frank's faith was so real and so extraordinary. In the resurrection, may Frank know how deeply his kindness mattered to people, and how profoundly he was and is loved. And may you and I catch a glimpse of the same truth, that when we wash a doll's feet, or are kind to a hurting person, or set the table at the Friday feast, or do some other act of loving kindness, we're inviting God's kingdom a little nearer. We're planting something and collaborating with God. We're planting a seed that grows in God's garden.